To start, I'm Andrew Dolkart, and I'm the director of the Historic Preservation Program, which along with Docomomo is a sponsor of this, and the preservation program has its annual James Marston Fitch Colloquium, and we're really thrilled that you're all here, and I'm sure a lot of other people will be coming. So let's just see. The annual Fitch Colloquium is a wonderful event where we in the historic preservation field, especially those of us who studied preservation here at Columbia during the early years of the program, and those who lived and worked in New York in the 1970s and 1980s, can remember one of the great men of the era, James Marston Fitch. And this is how I like to remember him, with that kind of quizzical expression on his face. The founder of Columbia's Historic Preservation Program, indeed the founder of the idea of preservation education and the idea that preservation could be a professional field of study. So I think that many of us in this room really owe a great debt to Jim. I had the privilege to study here at Columbia with Jim Fitch during his last 2 years at Columbia, and I would see him on occasion after that, and I'm always astounded that now I have the challenging honor of carrying on his legacy here at Columbia. In fact, my professorship is named for him. So the first thing I want to do this morning is praise James Marston Fitch, praise him not only for being the amazing person that he was, and for the generosity of spirit that led him to commit his life to preservation education, a commitment that we uphold, and I hope extend into the future each year when we meet for this Fitch Colloquium. I know that Jim would have been thrilled with today's topic, the preservation of public housing, because he was A, a modernist, and B, a man with a deep commitment to progressive social ideas about improving the lives of all people. What could be a better match than a conference that combines preservation with its commitment to historic built environments as a means of improving the lives of people, and public housing with its commitment to providing decent housing for all, irrespective of their wealth. Before we start examining the issues of post-war public housing, I want to thank a few people here at Columbia, and I know Theo will be thanking a lot of other people, but this could not have happened without the help of a lot of people here at Columbia who work either in or with the preservation program. First of all, I have to say that everything today, the responsibility for the success here is all Theo's. This was Theo's idea, and I said yes, and he ran with it. And so really, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the commitment that Theo Prudon has made to making this a great success. And I have to thank, in our office, Janet Foster, whom I know most of you know, and Andrea Marpeo Colomina, who really worked hard to make this work, the people in the AV office, and the people who deal with events here at Columbia, Gavin Browning and Paul Dallas, who worked really hard on making this a success. Titling the colloquium today proved to be somewhat problematic. When Theo and I started talking, we called the colloquium Preserving Public Housing, but it soon became evident that this title was misleading and would, for obvious reasons, be interpreted as a conference about saving housing as a social issue of habitation. While I suspect that all of us in the room are supporters of public housing as a social vision, and indeed probably support the expansion of public housing as a means to deal with the crisis of housing the poor and the middle class in our cities, this worthy topic was not what we had in mind. We're going to talk about issues of preservation of public housing as both a social vision of habitation and as an issue of the built world, of buildings, landscapes, people, and communities all combined. And I think that's what makes preservation an exciting field, is that we do want to combine these things. But we are going to look at these issues in many places in the world with a focus on housing created in the second half of the 20th century. This is a very timely issue, as those of you who read the New York Times know. I wish I could say that we planted this article, that the Times' new architecture critic and fantastic architecture critic, Michael Kimmelman, wrote about a housing project on the edge of Paris. But before we talk about preservation of public housing in the United States and especially abroad today, I want to note some of the challenges of preservation right here in New York City, which is my field of interest. New York City pioneered in the construction of public housing in the United States in the 1930s, when the idea of government investment in housing was anathema to large segments of the population that argued that the private market could solve the housing crisis, which of course we know to this day is not true. In general, public housing has been a success in New York, with long waiting lists to get into these projects and only 1 or 2 buildings demolished. The success of public housing in New York is now threatened by lack of funding for maintenance and by other factors, especially the federal government's cutback on housing support. But still, it provides habitation to tens of thousands of families. So this is one kind of preservation, the preservation of affordable housing units in government-sponsored buildings. Just as New York pioneered in building public housing, it pioneered in the recognition and preservation of these buildings, or at least the earliest of these buildings. So this is preservation in the sense that we in the historic preservation world think of preservation. In 1974, First Houses, the nation's earliest public-sponsored low-income housing project, and the first effort of the city's new housing authority, was designated an official landmark. This was followed by the designation of 2 of the earliest federal housing projects in the United States, Harlem River Houses, which was designated in 1975, and Williamsburg Houses, which was designated a city landmark in 2003. But their official recognition stops. These low-scale projects with their expansive open spaces were easy for the Landmarks Commission, but the Commission was unable to deal with later projects. And I want to give you just one example that sets the kind of idea of how difficult it is to do preservation of these buildings. For a number of years, the local preservation group Landmark West has been working with tenants of Amsterdam Houses, a 1947 project of 6- and 10-story buildings that is now located just west of Lincoln Center, but of course Lincoln Center wasn't there when this was built. Designed by prominent architects Grosvenor Atterbury and Harvey Wiley Corbett, with subtle massing, simple but expressive brickwork, and fine terraced landscaping. The Landmarks Commission rejected the proposal for a public hearing and designation because they said they did not have the knowledge to judge its value in relation to other projects of the time. To me, that is an incredible cop-out. So this is a challenge to someone in the audience, perhaps someone who's looking for a thesis topic, to look into this issue of post-war housing in New York. The 1944 10th Annual Report of the New York City Housing Authority is a good place to start, since this volume, published in the heat of World War II, not only illustrates the projects already completed, but looks optimistically to the future when the war would be over, proposing 10 new projects, including Amsterdam Houses. And I love this image because it just exudes optimism. It's sort of a billboard on a stand, and I love the way the letters flying off at a diagonal one way and a diagonal the other way down at the bottom. This was done during the war. It illustrates all the proposed projects with beautiful drawings. It's on crummy paper, but the drawings themselves are really beautiful. It includes proposals for some of my favorite projects in the city. I'm especially fond of John Lovejoy Elliott Houses in Chelsea with its pinwheel plan, and Abraham Lincoln Houses in Harlem with the variously massed buildings and the beautiful landscaped grounds around them. And if the Landmarks Commission cannot deal with these projects, which seem an easy sell to me, what about the Tower and the Park projects of the 1950s and 1960s? Here, the new generation of preservationists is way ahead of those in charge of landmarking. 2 years ago, for example, one of our students completed an excellent thesis arguing for the preservation of Sedgwick Houses in the Bronx, an early Skidmore, Owings and Merrill project designed and built at the same time that the firm's very famous, high-income, landmarked Manhattan House was designed, but a project that has almost never been written about in architectural histories. Not that all of these, of course, are worthy of preservation, but let's get to work advocating for those that are and make it clear why. Another issue to keep in mind today when we discuss the preservation of post-war public housing is that these complexes are not in general only about buildings, but also about siting and landscaping. Notable landscape architects were frequently involved in the designs or brought in later to enhance the landscapes, and these have suffered even more than the buildings. As I started reading about modern landscapes, I frequently read about how one of the seminal small parks of the 1960s was Paul Friedberg's playground in the 1940s Jacob Riis houses. Well, of course, I had to go see it, only to find when I got there that it had been destroyed without a peep from anyone in the preservation world at the time. A lot of people now bemoan the loss of this project, but nobody said anything when it was demolished. And I fear that if we do not take stock of what we have, here in New York, elsewhere in the United States, and around the world, and advocate for the preservation of significant public housing projects, we will lose more and more important buildings, landscapes, and yes, decent housing for all people. So that's all I want to say today, and I'm going to turn it over to Theo, who's going to really be the master of ceremonies for the day. So have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. I think before I begin the introduction of the actual subject and the speakers, I think it's important to explain all the different hats that I'm wearing here. I'm not only on the faculty of this program, I have been here as a result of James Marsden Fitch's invitation some 40-odd years ago. So I'm really here partially as a celebration of being here because of his initiative. But the second part is that, as you can see from the program, it is a joint venture, a joint effort between the program and that organization that everybody always sort of seemed to remember, but not quite, which is called Docomomo. And I do this every time. I sort of talk about the fact when we first started talking about Docomomo, people always would say, well, what is it again? Doko Popo, Doko Momo? And so it's one of those wonderful names that after a while as an acronym becomes sort of settled in people's mind. And I'm the president of the United States chapter, which is a chapter of an international organization that has currently about 59 chapters across the world in all 5 continents. So it's a really international movement. And again, talking about funny coincidences, is that I'm Dutch. And so this program, this organization started in Holland. I wasn't involved, but actually they were done by 2 people who were ahead of me in architectural school. So it's sort of interesting how all of these things come full circle. And I think that's why I decided when I talked to Andrew that housing would be an interesting subject to look at. And it would be an interesting subject for different reasons. In the American context, it is something that is very much in our mind, but it's really more as a technical, financial, cultural maybe issue, but certainly not in terms of social, public, affordability, whatever name we want to give to it. On the flip side, of course, is I went to school, an architectural school, when this was the period that housing was being built. And you will see in the presentations, for example, someone will talk about Cumbernauld, which is a project when I was in architectural school, we all looked at as something to be inspired by. And I think here we are some 40, 50, 60 years later, looking at what that preservation should be. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So these are all connections for me that makes this, in both as an event and as a subject, extremely interesting. But before I go into looking at a couple of slides with you to set the tone for what we will be looking at, I would like to sort of talk about the people that all make this happen. And Andrew thanked the people in the preservation program, in the architectural schools office, being Janet Foster, Gavin and Paul and Andrea. But I also like to add our own side, meaning the Docomomo side. And I think Liz Whitaker's, without her and all the students that supported this, we couldn't have done where we are now. And I'm very grateful that we arrived. But that's not the only support. The other support is you'll see both on the poster that's on the screen right now, but also on the program that's in your hands, I hope. And I would really like to thank for all those people that financially and practically made it possible to bring all the speakers here and make it possible not just to have an American discussion, but really to have an international discussion and look at what is happening in other parts of the world, as well as what's happening in the United States right now. And I think that the logos that you see on the screen, I think, speak for themselves. And I have to offer an apology to the French because their logo on the very far right, because of their topography, is very small. In the way it was set up, you can't really read it, but I hope that the French flag will be an indication that also we've got support from the French government. So with that, I would like to sort of talk about a little bit of how I arrived here. And I think that How I arrived at this subject is I started a presentation in Sydney, Australia about 4 years ago in the context of a conference called Unloved Modern. And the discussion there was really why people do not talk about the appreciation for modern architecture. And I decided that really the one subject nobody was talking about was housing. And so much part of the ideology and thinking process of many early modern architects was about the social responsibility, the social aspect of architecture and what we would bring to our collective communities. And so I started to think about it and talk about it. And of course, this is also the same time that Robin Hood Gardens, that project designed by Peter and Alison Smithen, was beginning to get into the news because of the aspect of demolition. Just as a explanation, the image that you're looking at here is Ralph Rapson's Cedar Riverside project in Minneapolis. It's late 1960s, early 1970s. It was never completely finished. This is probably a fifth or a third of the original plan, but it's still very much there. Much of the discussion in America is really dominated by this image. And you'll have seen, certainly in the last year or so, you have seen these photographs in many newspaper articles and other discussions. It's the Pruitt-Igoe project designed by Yamasaki in the mid-1950s and demolished in 1972. And this is really taken every time in any discussion, still today, as the starting point for what the failure of public housing is. But I think the interesting discussion that we, in the context of preservation, need to have is that much of that discussion, much of the demolition is equated with the idea that it's also the failure of modern architecture. And here what you see is the quote from the famous quote from Giles Jenks, where he declares modern architecture an utter failure because it was demolished in 1972. Of course, at that point he was writing about postmodernism, so clearly for him this was an ideological statement. But still, it sort of set the tone for a lot of the dialogue that we're still having today, and I think that's unfortunate. Both from a policy point of view, this sort of begins to mediate itself through in the various part of the newspapers. And you'll show you a couple of examples. These are articles I sort of collected out of the New York Times and there are other publications that begin to show you the same kind of discussion. It's the failure of public housing, particularly of high-rise buildings, without necessarily discussing that other part that we as heritage professionals or as preservation professionals need to think about, which is what is the cultural value? And I think that's where the tension is, what Andrew was also referring to, which is that social responsibility, the quality of life part of it, and at the same time, what is the architectural and cultural significance of something. So there's a tension there that we haven't really resolved very well. One of the examples is where probably the demolition or the elimination of the housing is really used more as part of a social issue than an architectural issue. And this is an early HUD project. It's 1941, Lafitte Houses in New Orleans. It's gone. But in itself as a housing project and quality of construction, because that's the other part I think we sort of need to think about. It wasn't bad. This photograph is about 3-4 years ago. It got demolished, but there was already at that point discussion about what the value of this is beyond just solving the social issues surrounding it. I'm not minimizing those, but I'm just putting out is that it's not the only discussion that should be taking place. The other part that worries me about this is that it's being replaced with, there's a great German word, and it really is no good English translation. It's called Ersatz. And Ersatz means it's something that is substituting for something. And so here is a little comparison about the top part is the plan as it was originally built, Lafitte Houses, and below is what is being constructed. Besides the fact that the density, of course, in terms of the number of units, which is partially also a function of the size of them, has been reduced. The other part is this is what is being proposed for it. And I think that, to me, there is not just an ideological, but a stylistic. I think this is where I think we're really getting confused. And again, I'm not just starting the discussion of postmodernism and new urbanism, although I have my thoughts about that. But it sort of begin to see where I think that the discussion is the wrong discussion to have, and the decisions we make are very different. And as I said, for me, this sort of began to focus when you begin to look at Peter and Alison Smith and Robin Hood Gardens, where one of the first times one of those projects go into the official approval cycle. That is to say, the official review process by which this thing needs to be done. And of course, it was nominated, it was reviewed, there was an inquiry, there was an appeal, the whole process. But the end of the result of this is that basically the decision, as we see it recently in the papers, is for demolition. The sad part is that it's going to be replaced, of course, with something that is low-rise, because part of the other discussion here, I think we need to think about, is that much of this is focused on high-rise construction, not necessarily low-rise. And so I think there's another confusion there. And here is in sort of little synopsis I made of all the arguments the Secretary of State in his rejection of the appeal made. And I think there's a fundamental question here, because the fundamental question is of architectural value that we all see. There is the question of quality of life, and then where do we place the issue of providing quality housing, but at the same time saving the patrimony, the heritage that we have gotten. And again, this is sort of an example of Robin Hood Gardens, but I really think that's sort of the beginning of the starting point of what this discussion may be like. And this is just little articles out of different parts of the discussion. And you can see on the top right is Lafitte again. On the left, you see the article that also Andrew showed, which is really so good for us and for everybody else. The fact that here is this whole discussion about public housing, not only in the United States, but in Europe and in the Times within the last week. But the other part is that why we wanted to look at the European context is because in many ways a lot of the ideas got started there, but also the ideas are now permeating into the aspect of heritage preservation. And here are two examples. On the right side is the French publication, which is quite recent, and on the left side is the World Heritage nomination that was done by the Germans for all of their Siedlungs, which is really low-rise housing in the 1930s and 1940s. Which really are examples of efforts to come to some understanding what that cultural value is. And I think we're very pleased that one of the authors of the French study, Jean-François Briand, is also one of our speakers today. And then so I think that here, if you look at the time, and I'm not using all the images that Andrew used, but if you begin to look at the newspapers, you begin to see there is a discussion taking place. And this is an example of Penn South, which is a union-driven, affordable housing project, of which are a number of them in New York City, which I think are in itself, both from a quality of life and from a quality of design, some things that we need to discuss. With that, we're going to turn to the program. We're a very dense program, so I am going to be pretty rigorous in keeping people's time. And because it's a Saturday, we're all here because we're interested in the subject, but it can be a very long day. So I will warn you that if I get up and sort of use my big hook to take somebody off the podium, is because I really like to take as much as possible, keep the schedule. In terms of organization conceptually, what we've done here is talk a little bit first about the American condition, partially because it's the easiest for us to organize. The second part is talking a little bit about the designation, research, and survey part, which is both reflected in the French and the Scottish examples, and then we'll talk about the actual interventions. What are people doing? So with that, I would like to introduce Joseph Heathcott, who is an associate professor at the New School, who will talk about public housing and 75 years. Joseph.
Thank you very much, Theo, and thank you, Andrew, and to all the organizers for having me here today. I'm very much appreciative of the chance to talk to all of you today about public housing, a topic near and dear to my heart. Of course, I can't resist using this image. Raises all kinds of questions that maybe we can talk about. I'll attempt to go through this as as best and as quickly as I can. What I want to do is to take a little step back to ask the broader question about what is it that we're preserving when we think about preserving public housing, and what are the various implications for that. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? I want to suggest, or at least argue in this particular presentation format, that there are a wide range of of areas or arenas of conversation that have to be enacted when we think about the preservation of public housing. And in my remarks, I'll be talking about the United States for the most part, but I will make reference to the international scene as well. And so I would argue that there are these 3, 6, 7 at least, but probably more, 7 sort of conditions or kind of large arenas of thinking that we need to sort of get our heads wrapped around when we talk about this topic. Certainly the preservation of buildings is an important issue, but there's also the kind of larger issue, the preservation of the kind of footprints, and because public housing was not just about singular buildings, it was also about a whole complex of urban ideas. We need to talk about the prehistorics, that is the kind of antecedents for public housing, both intellectually, but also the kinds of relationships, presence, and landscapes that were there before public housing existed and that were there afterwards and beyond. We need to think about the ideas. Public housing is as much a set of ideas as it is a set of sort of concrete achievements. And the intangibles, of course. Public housing is certainly bricks and mortar, but it is much more than bricks and mortar, as both Andrew and Theo indicated. It is a whole set of relationships and social values that cross time and space. We need to think very carefully, I would say, about the stocks, and by that I mean, public housing is, of course, at root, an attempt to provide affordable housing for as many people as possible, and that the stock of those units ebbs and flows and has been in decline in the context of the United States. And so as public housing disappears, as affordable housing units begin to dissolve into the ether, we need to start thinking about what it means if we're preserving public housing, or preserving not just the bricks and mortar, but also the idea of affordability, affordable housing. And also just to think about the futures. What does a future look like in which we actually are actively preserving public housing? Yeah, that's what I've been. I was just pressed. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, this is a little hard to read. It was supposed to be transparent in the background, but I'll read it to you. What is public housing? First, I just wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about public housing. And I would suggest that we're talking about the notion of the social investment in housing in the largest sense. I mean, we can begin to narrow terms, obviously, from there. But in the large sense, we're talking about the social investment in housing. We're talking about collectivities. That is, in the notion that collectivities can also produce housing just as sort of private endeavors can, and sometimes perhaps better, maybe sometimes not as well. That's an ongoing debate in the context of American housing, of course. And the collectivities in the 20th century have generally taken the form of the state. And so the state's role in the provision of housing and affordable housing in both the European and U.S. context has been a constant matter for debate. In terms of the United States, it's important to know that social investment in housing occurs in a federal system. In which our federal government, what we sometimes call the national government, although we don't really have a national government in the United States, we have a federal government, doesn't have necessarily a direct relationship with cities, and it has to go through a kind of tangle of institutional relationships to enact housing measures. That's something to keep in mind. There's the issue when we talk about public housing and the social investment of reform, the kind of reform of housing versus new construction. direct investment of government versus public subsidy, the development investment of housing in a concentrated way that is spatially concentrated versus dispersed and distributed investment. These are all sort of debates that continue over the course of the 20th century and how we provide public housing, and it definitely shapes the actual, the architectures, the spatial organizations and arrays of public housing. Public housing then usually refers, I would suggest, to, at least as I'll be using the term mostly today, as those set of programs that result in site-bound multifamily housing developments that are usually designed and owned by a public authority of one kind or another. Obviously, there's a tangled institutional history that I would suggest reflects the deep ambivalence in the United States about the government's role in public housing. I'm not going to go into this right now, although the institutional history itself is very interesting and revealing. That many agencies over the course of the 20th century have had something to do with the creation of affordable housing or low-income housing, and it has had a very varied and ambivalent institutional career and has sat uncomfortably in many respects within the United States government. More could be said about that. In the United States, I would also argue that there is a way in which public housing, that the programmatic has really been emphasized over the spatial. In other words, public housing is certainly planned, it's spatially located, but it's not part of some larger, overarching, comprehensive notion of spatial planning in the United States. It's very much project by project, and it's embedded within particular programs that produce housing units. And so the production of housing units is usually what is thought of when we think about creating public housing. And I won't go into the creation of these various programs, but they're all part of the kind of career and legacy of public housing in the United States. So first and foremost, obviously when we talk about preservation of public housing, we're talking about the preservation of buildings, and certainly the preservation of particular architectural traditions. We've already seen some of these images, Siedlung, and various other kinds of social housing. In other words, this is a kind of transatlantic architectural moment that emerges in the early 20th century, and there is a great deal of traffic at this time between the United States and Europe. Many folks in this room have studied this transatlantic exchange of ideas. And for example, just one of the many programs that allowed for this was the Oberlander Fellowship, on which a number of architects were able to travel to Germany to study public housing there. And in fact, we can see the remarkable similarities in the kind of design of public housing between for example, Germany and the United States. It's getting crowded out there for some reason. But on the right is one of the early PWA projects in St. Louis, Neighborhood Gardens, which looks extremely similar to German counterparts. So these transatlantic ideas constellated in the early public housing program in the United States, with very similar kinds of architectures and architectural commitments of modernism and other practices. And it's this early program that I mentioned, the Public Works Administration funded around 50, first 7 demonstration sites and then around 50 or so projects in the United States through direct federal investment in construction, which resulted in quite a number of really interesting projects, actually some of the best housing projects that have been built in the United States, I would argue. After that, of course, the United States Housing Administration took over after the 1937 Housing Act. The kind of scale of amenities and other sort of investments in buildings and architecture were cut back in favor of a much more kind of rigorous industrialized production of housing units, as we see beginning in the 1940s with the construction of housing projects. At the same time as public housing was being produced by the USHA, the United States Housing Authority, in the 1937 Housing Act, the Farm Security Administration was also providing housing for hundreds of thousands or more of people around the United States in rural areas, in migrant camps, and other investments. The early manufactured housing, as you see on the lower right, was part of these investments. In fact, one could argue that maybe one of the greatest successes in the production of affordable housing in the United States was, in fact, the subsidized production of manufactured housing in the 40s and 50s, modular, manufactured, industrially produced housing that really constitutes perhaps our largest stock of affordable housing in the country. Defense housing under the Lanham Act provided a lot of housing units for defense workers all across the United States. There were many interesting experiments in cooperative ownership by an agency called the Federal Works Administration. I won't go into that, but it was this is a Stoneroff designed complex outside of Philadelphia. Again, the Quonset huts and other kind of mass-produced, mobilized wartime housing, defense worker and military housing. This was really the kind of 1940s era of large-scale production. And of course, to the post-war period in which we begin to experiment more and more in the United States in cities around the country with high-rise housing forms for public housing. For a variety of reasons, both because of architectural trends, fads, and interests, but also because of the skyrocketing costs of land in inner cities and the need to go vertical in order to save money, various recessions that wave through the United States in the 50s that make materials much more expensive, and so forth and so on. This is, of course, a transatlantic phenomenon, obviously. This is not just confined to the United States. The kind of tower block, the production of tower blocks as a public housing solution crosses over to many parts of the world, and this is London with Balfron, Cranbrook, and Haygate estates, and then we can see that obviously in Bijlmer in Amsterdam as well. We have all sorts of experiments, ideas and phantasms of the high-rise housing blocks, the Ville-Réduits replacing cities or creating new cities. This is another set of tower slabs, public housing in Zanzibar, Michinzani, which was built by the East German government. Footprints, again back to Bijlmer. Footprints are the public housing projects in general, these kind of spatially co-located large-scale projects have footprints that are very much a part of the kind of modern urban planning process. In many of the countries in Europe, of course, public housing is built on greenfield sites, that is, undeveloped so-called land, although of course there are relationships present in those landscapes that are disrupted like anywhere else. But in the United States, public housing, certainly after World War II, becomes essentially a slum clearance program, and this is, and it's this easy, in fact. How to get rid of slums, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. But that's basically it is a slum clearance program. Thousands and thousands of acres are cleared away after World War II, and the passage of the 1949 Housing Act, which not only reauthorizes Wagner-Steagall, the 37 Housing Act, but provides a lot of money for new public housing construction in cities. So the footprints that are created in cities are really created by a kind of quite a violent process of ripping the cities apart internally, sort of scraping them, scraping away the kind of old relationships, the social relationships and economic relationships and cultural relationships that are present in those urban environments, and creating new urban footprints. This is Lakeview Terrace in Cleveland on the lower left. You can see it is really about the production of a new kind of urban form. This is Stonerov's Mackley Gardens in Philadelphia. We're familiar with this fine place, the Harlem River houses. neighborhood gardens in St. Louis. When this was built in St. Louis in 1934, one of the very first PWA projects, it's an urban form that had never been seen in this city. I mean, this was a dense working class neighborhood of tenements. This kind of urban form was brand new. And so it really is about the production of a kind of new footprint in the city. And obviously these footprints get very big. It's Prudon. And these footprints leave legacies. These footprints are actually these kind of hardscaping of these large modernist footprints of public housing are very durable. They're obdurant. They have an obdurant quality. And this is the Prudon site today. It hasn't gone away. It's mostly still there. It just happens to be forested. Prehistories, again, I'm very interested in when we think about preservation of public housing, that we also begin to take account of the kind of neighborhoods that were there before public housing was created. And I think that's just incumbent upon us to think about public housing as itself. The part of the legacy that we're preserving is a legacy of transformation, right? So public housing is a kind of dynamic legacy, not a static one. It's not just that those buildings or those communities were static. It's that they were part of a kind of ongoing evolutionary process, if you will, of urban transformation. Episodic, I would say, perhaps more than evolutionary. This is El Paso, an area that was cleared out. This is DeSoto Carr in St. Louis that was cleared out for the creation of large-scale housing projects. That just shows where this picture was taken, in very dense working-class African-American neighborhood that was largely cleared out for public housing. In addition to, obviously, to the architectures, the footprints, are also, of course, the ideas. And what are the ideas that public housing embodies? What are the ideas that public housing reflects and then influences over time? Some of the sort of basic ideas that inform public housing over time, I think we're familiar with, but it just bears some mention. Obviously we're talking about things like the minimum existence, or the minimum dwelling, which is becoming newly relevant in many respects. So I think it's worth revisiting as a preservation issue as we sort of recover from sticker shock and from massive overproduction of giant housing units in the United States. Rethinking this whole notion of how can we live minimally on the land in a sustainable way is a really important question. Housing as a social endeavor. Is something, I think, an idea worth revisiting over and over again. That is, housing that's more than just a kind of a private solution to a private problem, but rather a collective effort to solve a set of social problems or social conditions and collective investments at large scale. Ideas about design that move across national boundaries and that influence large numbers of people in many, many places around the world. Ideas about social problems, how we define social problems, and how we imagine solving the social problems. What is the location of the social problematic? Public housing was one of the big responses in the 20th century to the notion that the social problematic can be located in physical space. Then, of course, ideas about how to message those social problems and how to message the solutions to those social problems are also part of the legacy of public housing that we have to think about as we talk about preservation. Ideas about the role of housing in alleviating social problems. That is housing the solution to crime? Is good housing the solution to crime? I mean, that is an idea that drove a lot of the production of housing reform and the making of housing units, and we have to really think very carefully about that. Ideas about land, property, challenges to liberalism and to the laissez-faire real estate economy that public housing presented. These are really important, I think, legacies to think about when we think about preservation. It's not just the housing units. I mean, in some ways the architecture and the housing, the buildings themselves are I don't want to say epiphenomenal, but they certainly are part of a much larger set of ideas that transcend time and space. And also the kind of difficult and very unseemly aspects of the history of public housing. Public housing in the United States was, for most of its early existence, explicitly segregated racially. What does that mean? How did public housing contribute to the further segregation of cities in the United States? These are really deep and important questions, I think, that we have to begin to ask when we think about preserving what preservationist Robert Wyneth has called difficult sites. Also, and I'd say slightly ironically, we then have to look at the ideas that arose in response to the perceived problems of public housing itself, right? Ideas that eventually became very powerful in reformulating our notion of what public housing was and what we should do about it. So ideas like Oscar Newman's ideas about defensible space, which I could go into a lot if we had time. I'd love to go into this. I think, well, anyway, I'm not even going to say what I think right now. But these notions had a huge impact on our thinking and discourse about public housing. Notions about housing design, the kind of design responses to that blast image of Pruitt-Igoe that we saw. Ideas about public policy and the role of policy in the production of housing units. The idea of social conditions, the role of society in making or breaking public housing. And for me, perhaps one of the most important things to think about when we think about historic preservation is the preservation of the intangible. That is, what are the kind of intangible qualities of public housing that are important to keep in mind as we think about the buildings themselves? Obviously, the buildings are important, but there's also a whole set of intangible relationships. And of course, historic preservation as a practice has had increasingly turning towards the intangible as a really important aspect of preservation. And so there are rich and deep social relationships that inhere and inform in the context of public housing over time. Daily life, growing up, kind of quotidian experiences that provide the richness and the grain of life, the affects of housing, the memories of housing. And whether it's in Pruitt-Igoe, for example, in this case, or in Bijlmermeer, there are relationships that form in these projects that have to be thought about. These are places where people grow up, they have life experiences, their life course stretches out, they have their first dates, they live, they die. And regardless of the place, whether it's Stateway Gardens, Bijlmermeer, Pruitt-Igoe, or the Jane Addams homes, it's really important to think about those aspects. Stocks, I don't think we should be thinking about public housing preservation in the United States without thinking about the very notion of affordability and the availability of housing units. That is, the very purpose of public housing was to provide affordable housing for as many people as possible. So in addition to preserving the buildings, it's also worth our time to think about what those buildings represented in terms of a kind of commitment to providing affordable housing. Now, and millions, hundreds of thousands and over 1 million units of inventory were produced in the 20th century. But it's also important to keep in mind, though, that public housing was always a small part of American housing, that the U.S. is an intensely private culture. Public housing always sat very ambivalently within our body politic and with our notions of ourselves as dwelling people. The American dream still revolves, despite the collapse in the housing market, still revolves intensely around the notion of the single-family detached home as the way towards prosperity and happiness. We can see that the vast majority of housing in the United States, of course, still is single-family detached housing, and 7% you see there is also manufactured housing. That's the trailer parks and so forth that I mentioned earlier. So that brings the total up really up to 70%, because those are mostly single-family and detached. So it's a very large part of our housing stock, and public housing itself is a rather small part of an already small kind of program of the production of affordable or subsidized housing in the United States, at least on the low income side. But at the same time, as we experience a decline in the number and availability of affordable housing units in the United States, there's ever more need actually for public housing or for social investments in housing. And that's a kind of one of the sad ironies of the whole story, is that people are spending more and more money on their housing despite the fact that housing markets have collapsed. And that's a kind of distressing state. The HUD budget, of course, has taken nosedives over time, and it's never fully recovered from the 1970s highs that it experienced. And public housing still is immensely dwarfed in terms of the subsidization by the major housing subsidies in the United States, which are private market subsidies for mortgage interest reductions and other programs. At the same time, there are many efforts by people around the United States, especially residents of public housing, to save the existing stock of public housing, the places where they live, their homes. And I think anyone who takes an interest in the preservation of buildings, that is public housing buildings, also ought to be interested in and supportive of these movements by people on the ground for social justice in terms of housing, and particularly in terms of preserving what they have. There's more of the Hope 6 stuff that we all love. That's rapidly replacing public housing. And we see here Darst Webby in St. Louis on the lower right, and the King Louis Square, which replaced it on the upper left. And this was actually the site of the first major legal challenge to the Hope 6 program, a lawsuit that's actually still sort of ongoing, and there's not been much resolution to it. In which the people who lived in Darst Webby alleged, and I think correctly, that there really was no replacement plan for the affordable units that were being destroyed by the creation of this Hope 6 project. And so the units disappear. These kind of very hard-fought and hard-won collective responses that include large-scale public investment disappear in these kind of what I would call rather somewhat private land grabs represented by Hope 6. And no matter how bad it got sometimes in the United States in public housing, these kind of hard-scaped projects still represent the embodiment of large-scale public investments in the idea of housing, that is, in housing, and the idea that collectivities can be responsible for housing, that housing is in fact a social matter, a matter for social investment and preservation. So how to imagine public housing in the future, just last few remarks, how to imagine public housing preservation moving forward. I've talked about this already, but I think one of the things we have to do in terms of thinking about historic preservation around public housing is, of course, to unwind all the kind of standard narratives about public housing that exist. All the sort of things we think we know about public housing that have to start to be unwound. And we have to begin to craft new narratives and tell new stories about public housing in the United States. We have to begin to pay attention to, recover, honor many of the good functions and aspects of public housing and social housing that exist around the United States and around the world. Not only the kind of building and architectural legacies, but the human and cultural legacies. And I couldn't resist putting one of my favorite rap artists, Roxanne Shante, here from Queensbridge Houses. A lot of great rappers came from Queensbridge Housing, which I live not too far from, actually. So there's a lot of incredible sort of cultural legacy that comes from this investment. Public housing in New York has had many problems, but it's doing just fine. So there are many kind of new, different kind of narratives. We should all read Nick Bloom's book on public housing in New York, titled "Public Housing That Worked." And I think there's some real interesting. There's an interesting kind of truth to that that we need to pay attention to. The public housing there's such an ambivalent relationship in the United States towards public housing, ambivalent attitudes, that we really need to recover these kinds of narratives of success. Not to obviously overdo it, but to understand that it's a much more complicated story. preservation in terms of public housing is going on as we speak. There's been a lot of renovation and rehabilitation of historic public housing projects. Stonewall's Mackley houses, Mackley apartments rather, here on the left in Philadelphia were renovated not that long ago. Neighborhood Gardens in St. Louis, kind of a counterpart to Mackley houses, was also renovated recently, and actually is now quite nice, a low to moderate income rental housing project. I'll just go through these more quickly. Obviously, I couldn't resist also including a picture of the Water Petra. This is a really wonderful renovation of a 60s housing project. But at the same time, we also have other kinds of preservation going on. The preservation of the sites themselves through the Hope 6 program. Now, I have a whole range of things I could say about the Hope 6 program, not too many of them good. But the one interesting thing is that the actual sites, the diagrammatic issues of the sites, the diagrammatic form of the sites persists, and that's actually quite interesting. I'll just move on to say that we'll hear later from a colleague on the historic preservation around public housing involves the production of a national public housing museum, which I think is a very exciting development. And lastly, just in terms of preservation moving forward, we have to begin to recover the kind of stories of people who lived in public housing, who've experienced public housing, whose voices have not been heard nearly as much in the process. And this is a wonderful backdrop for a Prudon Alumni Association reunion dance in St. Louis, where people get their pictures taken. And lastly, just the idea that these are kind of ephemeral, memorious aspects, but we really need to work hard to recover them so that we don't really lose everything when we just preserve the buildings and public housing. Thank you.
I think I need to apologize to Joseph for having to make him talk so fast to get within his time. It's interesting because I think not only the dialogue, but also how memories and things come back. And you reminded me of Queensbridge, and I was the president of the Jacob Riis Settlement House, which is located within Queensbridge for about 15 years. And I really experienced that project, which is one of the largest housing projects in New York. And I would agree, there's a whole culture, there's a whole story that attaches to that, which we in preservation or in the physical preservation not necessarily always think about. The other part is, of course, Catherine Bauer, who was one of the early housing advocates, was very active at Columbia in the late 1930s, and of course Oscar Newman, who was defensible space taught here in the 1960s and 1970s. So what's really nice is also partially this is about the tradition of Columbia. With that, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Milnarik, who is a practicing architect and has a doctorate in architectural history, and will talk about the preservation of form and function in American public housing.
I just want to start off and say how excited I am to be here, and grateful, and also very excited that this topic is of interest, and I'm very interested in learning about the topics, particularly this afternoon with foreign public housing. It's really, really great. In the United States, public housing is a broad program that provides affordable housing to families and senior citizens in small towns as well as major cities. But in the last 3 decades, the urban superblock high-rise has become the symbol of the program at large, and its architecture somehow has become a visual representation for larger issues of 20th century deindustrialization, segregation, and suburbanization, as well as the resultant pervasive cycles of urban crime and poverty. Popular acceptance of the program as a failure, and I'm not going to make the air quotes, but I want to make sure that I'll get that across my tone, has abetted federal funding cuts and the dismantling of this valuable social support infrastructure. Many of these projects are clearly historic, both architecturally innovative and culturally significant. And as government assets, they are bound by federal preservation regulations. Maintaining, altering, restoring, and preserving public housing complexes presents interesting challenges, and we're going to review several examples and discuss how they test the boundaries of preservation practice. I propose, however, that preservationists also have a role to play beyond simply protecting public housing as it exists. Our public housing system is in need of reform, but since the 1990s, policy has been primarily reactionary, premised upon this faulty assumption of total failure, and has resulted in unnecessary demolition and destruction. As historian activists, preservationists have the opportunity to provide a more balanced view of public housing, to contextualize it within the government's array of housing support programs and within broader social and economic changes, to bring the positive aspects of our American public housing legacy to light, and in this way to contribute to the best possible housing future for us all. Before we begin our discussion of public housing preservation projects, let me briefly outline America's preservation regulations, the tools of the profession. The first step is to determine if a building or project is historically significant or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Buildings must be over 50 years old to reach that benchmark, but an exception can be made if significance warrants it. Then an argument must be made for their archaeological or architectural importance, or their connection with significant people or events. Most housing projects, such as Paumanok homes in Flushing, will be considered as a whole complex, with the site design and each individual building contributing, although, for example, Rosa Parks Flat in Montgomery's Cleveland Court could perhaps be found individually eligible for its connection to the civil rights leader. The complex must also retain its integrity, the ability to communicate its story. Interiors are not typically considered for their impact on integrity, but changing street patterns, demolishing some structures, or altering the exterior of buildings could have an impact on a project's integrity, particularly if it's being nominated for its architectural significance. If a federally owned housing project is determined eligible for the National Register by state and federal officials, then any changes using federal funding must be evaluated under Section 106 of the 1996 National Historic Preservation Act for their impact on the historic resource. All work should follow the Secretary of Interior standards for the rehabilitation of historic properties, better known as the 10 Commandments of Preservation. Briefly stated, the standards call for a sympathetic new use, the retention of distinctive historic features and any historic changes, the repair rather than replacement of historic elements, and the use of gentle cleaning and repair methods. New additions should be distinguishable but sympathetic to the historic resource. In short, there's a lot of flexibility within those rules. If a proposed federally owned rehabilitation project does not follow the standards and is determined to negatively impact the design integrity of a housing project, the reviewer may suggest alternatives and must establish mitigating measures. The Section 106 process provides an opportunity for interested parties to weigh in and depends upon the interest and knowledge of state and federal reviewers, as well as the advocacy of preservationists to make sure that a fair argument is made. Popular pressure, as well as the length and complexity of the process, can often discourage an owner from pursuing a project that will have a negative impact. But Section 106 cannot ultimately block the alteration or demolition of any structure or project. Privately owned properties have no legal preservation requirements, but do qualify for valuable tax credits if they rehabilitate their buildings in accordance with the standards. Many public housing projects in the U.S. have been recognized as historic for their design and their cultural significance. Begun as a make-work program of the Depression-era New Deal, the government built a burst of housing in the build-up to World War II. Following the war, public housing authorities, with their valuable powers of eminent domain, became key players in urban renewal in many cities, acquiring land and rehousing many of those displaced from demolished neighborhoods. In the late 1960s, urban depopulation and economic shift and well-founded accusations of racism in site selection brought much public housing construction to a halt, called attention to a need for reform, and spurred innovations in public housing policy. In 1973, St. Louis famously detonated a pair of buildings at Prudon in an effort to improve the functioning of the larger project. Reformers also began to acknowledge racial and economic isolation as a fundamental flaw in the program. Chicago, Houston, Seattle, and many other cities turned to unit-by-unit scattered sites programs, while the federal Newtown In-Town program constructed interesting mixed-income projects at Roosevelt Island and Ralph Rapp's in the Cedar Square West in Minneapolis. Beginning in the 1980s, mismanagement, a consistent lack of maintenance, and urban stagnation raised the volume on the call for housing reform. In 1984, the Boston Housing Authority undertook an innovative redevelopment of Columbia Point, the city's largest housing project. Built in 1954 on an industrial and fill district, Columbia Point had a mix of low and high-rise units. Bordering the bay on the north, the isolated, under-maintained 1,500-unit housing project was very visible from downtown and enjoyed amazing views of the city. Building on the success of the small America Park project in Lynn, Massachusetts, at Columbia Point, current residents formed a partnership with the development firm Corcoran Jennison and assumed responsibility for the revitalization and management of the area in return for a 99-year lease. Predicated on redeveloping the site for a mixed-income occupancy, the developers raised more than $200 million in loans and subsidies for the rehabilitation of the district. Building on Jane Jacobs' Greenwich Village observations and Oscar Newman's defensible space analysis, the new plan altered the street pattern, running a generous boulevard through the center of the project and introducing a modified street grid, and that's the plan you see on the right. Demolishing 17 of Columbia Point's original 27 residential buildings, the other 10 were altered, and the designers built more than 30 new row house and apartment structures. The new complex, rechristened Harbor Point, opened in 1990 with a total of 1,283 units. 400 of those were reserved for low-income families. Although unquestionably more livable than Harbor Point in its dilapidated state, the renovation represented a loss of 1,100 public housing units to the city of Boston. The retention of 10 of the existing buildings illustrates the adaptability and viability of these structures. The Columbia Point Harbor Point project was understood as a genre-defining success and became one of the principal models for the federal Hope 6 effort, which began in 1992 as a large-scale response to problems in public housing, directed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Building upon the recommendations of a congressional commission, the Hope 6 program aimed to develop housing based on the new urbanist model, advocating for mixed-use, walkable communities. Units of varying size and cost are interspersed and typically come with neo-revivalist architectural detailing. HUD, however, weaves in defensible space principles and calls their approach traditional neighborhood development. Apartment buildings and density in general are regarded as significant safety risks, with a preference for row houses, duplexes, and single-family homes with adjacent parking. And I include the Hope 6 project in San Francisco as a significant exception to this. This is North Beach Place. Anybody who's been to San Francisco, it's near Pier 39 and all of that. And so there it is a fairly dense project. The residents still have parking, though, which is a luxury for anybody in San Francisco. All units have direct street access, giving residents a feeling of control over their exterior spaces, and it's a significant conception. What happened at Westfield Acres, up above, that's also by Stonerov. Westfield Acres was an amazing project and went down without lament, tragically, and what was built is pretty standard suburban fare. Oh, sorry. From 1992 until 1995, Hope 6 got underway with 35 planning grants, targeted at the 6% of housing projects classified as severely distressed in the congressional study. Between 1993 and 2010, however, the program expanded in scope, and HUD awarded $6.5 billion for 549 demolition and revitalization grants in public housing communities across the U.S. The grants funded changes to many projects that were not initially identified as severely distressed. In 17 years, HUD directly funded the demolition of nearly 57,000 units, and since the bulk of the revitalization projects cut available public housing units by 2/3, in the end, the total loss of public housing units was much higher than that. Traditional neighborhood development's opposition to density and its parking requirements, often regardless of context, have posed significant problems for preservation in public housing. In addition, too rarely have planners recognized the valuable investment in existing public housing. Renovation costs are often cited as being equal to new construction, but little heed is paid to the superior durability of historic masonry buildings versus new light frame construction, the greater sustainability of renovation, as well as the cultural value of maintaining historic structures. New Orleans public housing has been subject to considerable recent interest, as the Housing Authority of New Orleans took the city's 2005 evacuation as a moment to shutter its 4 largest projects and to initiate Hope 6 programs at a moment when the city was in significant need of inexpensive dry housing. C.J. Pete, or Magnolia, opened in 1940 for African American residents. 2-story gable roof row houses and apartment buildings were arranged around courtyards, and the project was expanded over time in this pattern, eventually accommodating 1,400 low-rise units. Adjacent to Tulane and the Garden District, Magnolia was closed after Hurricane Katrina, and Hano partnered with developers to construct Harmony Oaks, which follows HUD's traditional neighborhood pattern carefully, but now provides only about 150 units of public housing, with 300 others that are market rate and moderately subsidized. A few buildings from the historic project were retained and rehabilitated, illustrating their viability and appeal as contemporary housing. Memphis's Lauderdale Courts represents one of the strongest examples of preservation in the Hope 6 era. Originally designed by a team headed by prominent local architect J. Fraser Smith, Lauderdale was built for white families during the New Deal. The project has 66 brick residential buildings ranging from 1 to 4 stories and originally accommodated 449 apartments, row houses, and flats. Row houses on the east side of the project are sited along a grassy horseshoe. You can see that above in the plan, with the project office at the center, creating a striking ensemble that also functions as a protected play space for children. In the late 1990s, Lauderdale Courts was proposed for Hope 6 renovation, but its distinguished design, along with the fact that Elvis Presley lived there from 1949 until 1953, created interest in its preservation. A local developer partnered with the Memphis Housing Authority to rehabilitate the project as a mixed-income residential district. Some small units were combined to create larger ones, more suited to current rental standards. Interiors were renovated and rear courts were turned into parking, but little about the buildings or the overall site plan changed. Marketed as Uptown Square, the project reopened in 2004 with 347 mixed-income units. The project is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and while the transformation of the original rear open spaces alters the design slightly, the buildings largely retain their historic appearance, and this can be understood as a model example of public housing preservation. More than simply a good place to live, Lauderdale Courts illustrates how, with appropriate maintenance and renovation, existing public housing complexes are attractive housing options. In terms of units, however, the number of low-income units have gone from 449 to less than 175, a significant loss. Similarly, the Chicago Housing Authority has renovated Trumbull homes to meet contemporary code and living standards as part of a public-private housing partnership. Trumbull, however, remains fully occupied by public housing residents. Lauderdale Courts and many other mixed-income projects have been undertaken in gentrifying neighborhoods desirable to those able to pay market-rate rents. In Memphis, from the 1940s until 1960s, Lauderdale's larger slum district was remade through urban renewal. An interstate highway replaced the railroad to the north of the project, and in 1962, Danny Thomas opened St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital just on the other side of the highway. So if you look at this plan, does this have a, oh, sorry, no. Anyway, if you look at this plan, you can see the railroad up on the top. The highway cuts much closer to Lauderdale Courts, and the Danny Thomas Hospital is right on the other side of it. It's within a block. In contrast, Chicago's Trumbull Homes is located on the far south side of Chicago in an area adjacent to the Lake Calumet Shipping District. It is not sufficiently attractive to market-rate housing, yet was admirably renovated, again illustrating the value and good design in public housing. In Chicago, projects located in valuable areas like the Gold Coast adjacent Cabrini Green project have followed the pattern set at Magnolia, with full demolition and replacement with mixed-income units. At Dearborn Homes, however, the Chicago Housing Authority challenged that pattern by funding the work itself and maintaining the low-income status of the residents. Built in 1950, Dearborn Homes on Chicago's south side is composed of 16 buildings of 6 to 9 stories, accommodating 800 apartment units set into a single superblock. This was the first of Chicago's projects built after World War II, the first over 4 stories, the first to require elevators, the first we could consider high-rises. Just over 50 years old, Dearborn Homes is clearly of historic significance. The Chicago Housing Authority's Plan for Transformation, released in 2000, proposed eliminating all high-rise family projects, but Dearborn Homes, at just 9 stories, didn't quite fall into that category. Rather, the Housing Authority hired HPZS, a Chicago firm with preservation experience, to undertake a $165 million rehabilitation of the project. The primary work has been to significantly rehabilitate the interiors. As at Lauderdale Courts, particularly small units have been combined, and some have been enlarged to meet accessibility standards, reducing the overall apartment count from 800 to 660. But those are entirely public housing units, rather than mixed income. The project installed new heating, plumbing, and electrical systems, as well as adding air conditioning. Finishes in public areas and apartments have been upgraded. On the exterior, well-proportioned, if stark facades have been elaborated with cast stone coins, and end cornices are topped with pediments and acroterion. Clearly applied, and certainly contrary to the spirit of the modernism that directed Lobel, Schlossman, and Bennett as the original designers, the decoration does significantly alter the appearance of the buildings and has been warmly received by the residents. This project illustrates the easy adaptability of these structures. Opened in 1966 and designed by Bertram Goldberg, Chicago's Hilliard Homes is a remarkable complex and one of Goldberg's masterworks. A complex with 756 units in 2 curving family buildings and 2 round elderly elevator buildings. On the south side, Hilliard was not particularly attractive for market rate development, but the CHA and a private firm found a way to invest in a rehabilitation without moving the complex to mixed income occupancy. In 1997, the complex was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, ahead of the standard 50-year mark, in order to qualify for historic tax credits, which became key to meeting the needed financing for the rehabilitation, which began in 2002. With updates rather than significant alterations, Hilliard remains fully dedicated to low-income families. Goldberg meant his project to be a leading example of powerful, passionate design when it was constructed, and through the recent preservation project, it will remain so for another 50 years. Just as the regionalist designers of the 1930s and the modernist planners of the mid-century, public housing officials and designers of the Hope 6 period have hung their hopes on new urbanist principles, promising that nostalgic architecture and a street grid will resolve the failures of the previous programs. More lightly built, the long-term durability and appearance of these areas remains an open question. Hope 6 has constructively aimed at solving issues of economic segregation, but the program has traded in solid buildings publicly owned for a fewer number of new but more lightly built units tied up in partnerships with private for-profit developers. Currently, Section 8 vouchers provide off-site rebated rents for many of those displaced, but this program's landlord preferences mean that many renters remain economically segregated. Also, Section 8 is a program without any permanent federal commitment, and those families will always be at some risk of defunding. America seems to be caught in a cycle of replacing housing for our poorest every few generations, in concert with the newest planning concept of the moment. This pattern profits the construction industry, but causes a loss of historic fabric, a blow to neighborhood patterns, a disruption to residents' lives, as well as a waste of viable infrastructure and embodied energy. Under Hope 6, large modernist complexes have been demolished and replaced with, again, homogeneously planned and designed districts. The problems inherent to this distinctive planning approach will gradually emerge over time, and combined with less durable construction and seemingly inevitable undermaintenance, these areas may again become reviled urban areas to be thrown away and resown. In addition, as many of the Hope 6 projects have transferred ownership to private developers, they represent a loss to our public sphere, an abandonment of our shared infrastructure that increases the likelihood of homelessness for our poorest citizens. In many instances, maintaining and improving existing public housing through more targeted small design gestures would have been a better, more economical solution, but requires dependable, sustained funding, bureaucratic responsiveness, delicate investigation into existing conditions, and site-specific sensitive design solutions, rather than a dependence on a formulaic traditional neighborhood policy. Aesthetically, the bulk of the Hope 6 projects are disappointments, missing the thoughtful whimsy and interesting textures that define new urbanism, and aiming to conform to dull market-rate residential norms. Of course, their chief responsibility is not to entertain over-analytical architects and historians, but rather to accommodate their residents' needs well. In the past, however, public housing has been at the forefront of planning and architectural design. In the best instances, at Williamsburg Homes in Brooklyn and Hilliard Homes in Chicago, for example, public housing has embodied its true spirit of civic passion and responsibility, and transcended mere building to become art. New mixed-income projects, with their anxious need to conform and design deceptions in regard to unit cost, cannot hope to achieve such a feat, and also sadly reveal our nation's pervasive mistrust and fear of each other, and necessarily our collective self. Of course, not all public housing of any era has been great, but at a moment when the American dream of home ownership has contributed to a global economic crisis, Hope 6's failure to challenge the concept of failure in public housing, their private partnerships, the loss of units, and the loss of cultural memory are a missed opportunity to help our nation re-envision its housing future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, thought when Elizabeth was talking, one of the things that always strikes me as being interesting in this housing discussion, that actually since the end of the 1930s, one of the major economic indicators has always been housing starts. And that maybe one of the challenges we have as preservationists maybe to have an economic indicator that is something like houses reused or whatever formulation you want to give with that. But with that, we are only 8 minutes behind schedule, which is really wonderful. And so let's have coffee, ask all the questions of the speakers, and let's return here about 11 o'clock.
I don't have a plastic.